Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think you can hear me. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes because we are very limited with time and being able to use this facility. So just to let you know, 5 minutes and we're going to get started. So thank you again for coming to the second biannual Emergency Preparedness Program that is sponsored by the Volunteer Mobilization Center of Whatcom County that are known as the VMC. We appreciate that we are a program under the Ferndale Community Service Cooperative, a nonprofit 501c3, who took us in under their umbrella when we were faced with finding a new home at the end of 2006 so that we could continue our volunteer mission for all of Whatcom County during times of disaster. So who the VMC really is. VMC services Whatcom County during times of disaster and is directed by the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office Division of Emergency Management. Further information regarding the VMC can be found on the tables in the back of what our mission is and how we actually operate. The VMC is solely a volunteer organization, operated exclusively and only by volunteers. So there's no paid positions. Everybody that participates is volunteer. All funding for the VMC so that we can carry out events such as this and participate in community fairs and so forth are provided by donations and grants that we receive. So I want to thank all of those who have provided funding for us, and that includes the individual donations, River Styx, Puget Sound Energy Foundation, Whatcom Educational Credit Union, and Whatcom Community Foundation. I'd also like to thank those folks that have volunteered today, both from the VMC membership, from the Community Emergency Response Team, which is CERT, and they've provided our traffic management outside, the Red Cross, Map Your Neighborhood, and the amateur radio clubs. If you've not had the opportunity to visit any of the tables in the back, please take a moment at the end of the program because they will be there for a while. So today we have a really great program for you. And, those that will be presenting, our panel consists of Pete Stelling, Associate Professor of Geology, Western Washington University Geology Department, Jackie Caplan-Auerbach, Professor of Geology, Western Washington University Geology Department, Dr. Seth Moran, Scientist in Charge, Cascades Volcano Observatory, U.S. Geological Survey Volcano Science Center, that's a mouthful, Dr. Rebekah Paci-Green, Associate Professor, Western Washington University Environmental Sciences Department and Director of Resilience Institute, and John Gargett, who's the Deputy Director of the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department, or Sheriff's Office Division of Emergency Management. So what the process will be, each panel member will have 15 minutes to present. You're asked to hold all of your questions until all presenters have completed their presentations. There will be an opportunity for a Q&A session for the remainder of the time that we have allotted. If you have a question, you will need to step to the microphone and we'll only be able to ask one question. There won't be any compound questions or elaborating on, something that they have said, because we are really limited in time and we need to be courteous to others and provide equity so people have a chance to ask their questions, okay? So, I think that pretty much covers it. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So our first presenter now will be Dr. Pete Stelling. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Again, my name is Pete Stelling. I'm up at Western Washington University. I teach geology up there, and I wanted to talk with you about, kind of introduce how volcanoes work and the eruptive history of Mount Baker. So this is a picture of Mount Baker. Notice that, so this is the summit of Mount Baker. Right here is Sherman Crater. And Sherman Crater, you might have seen in the news recently, was steaming. There was a steaming event. We can see that every once in a while, but it turns out that this steaming area is steaming all of the time. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. Only sometimes are the atmospheric conditions right for us to be able to see it from here. So nothing at Baker has changed, and there's no worry, no need for alarm. But I wanted to start out with why volcanoes erupt in the first place. Does anybody have any idea why a volcano would erupt? Okay, pressure's building. And what builds up the pressure? The thing that's causing the pressure is the same thing that's causing the pressure in this soda. And so when I take this and erupt this at Seth, so why, you knew it was coming too, didn't you? So the reason that this erupts is because there is gas trapped in this sugar water, and the CO2 gas is trying to get out. And all the gas wants to do is rush out and join its atmospheric brethren. But it drags a whole bunch of soda along with it. So if the CO2 were just to come out on its own, it wouldn't be an issue and Seth wouldn't have run away. But it's the sugar water that he didn't like. And so the bubbles are dragging all of that sugar water out of the can. And it works the same way with a volcano, except that the sugar water is actually liquid rock, and the bubbles are mostly made up of water. There's a little bit of CO2 and there's a little bit of sulfur in there. But the thing that actually drives a volcanic eruption are bubbles. And depending on whether a magma has a lot of bubbles, it can be pretty fizzy, and we can get some really energetic soda here, or an energetic eruption, or it can be really flat. So there's not many bubbles left in it. Depending on how many bubbles are in it and how much gas is in it, that really controls how that volcano is going to erupt. So let's look at what these different eruptions kind of look like. There are the low-level ones, the flat soda, with not many bubbles in it, not many bubbles to drive the eruption really explosively. So these are called effusive eruptions, and here we see lava flows. This is at Kilauea. Here's another lava flow at Mount Etna in Sicily. And what it does is it produces a flat, or really gently sloping, really broad volcano called a shield volcano. And that's what Mauna Loa looks like here in Hawaii. Alternatively, there are other volcanoes that have a lot of energy in them, a lot of bubbles, and that can drive really explosive eruptions. And those explosive eruptions, like this one here with a little bit of lightning in there every once in a while, caused by the ash particles hitting each other, building up static electricity. It produces layers of lava flow when it's a really flat soda and erupting out with lava flows, or it can be a really explosive eruption. You get layers of ash on top of that. And so these kinds of volcanoes, called a composite volcano, it's also called a stratovolcano, those are made up of layer after layer after layer into the steep-sided, kind of an overgrown anthill-looking edifice, okay, that mountain. So, with that in mind, why would anyone want to live near an active volcano? Any ideas? Why are you here? Because you're here. You're one of these people. It's awful pretty. Yeah, it's all kinds of pretty. Okay, there's usually water. There's really good soil. And it turns out that geology is controlling all of that. So if we look at plate tectonics, that on the surface of the Earth there are these rigid plates that are moving around and kind of playing bumper cars with each other, and one of the ways that they move around is to dive under another one. And in this case, this is able to generate magma here, and it produces a bunch of volcanoes. But what this also does is the plate that is subducting is an oceanic plate, because it's sitting a little bit lower, it has all this water above it, and that means that right on the coast here, where we get this coastline, is where we get volcanoes too. And that coastline produces a lot of commerce. There's great fishing. It's really easy for ports to be in there, so there's a lot of industry that exists. They happen to be right next to volcanoes, like this. So here is Bellingham, there's Fairhaven right here, and here is Mount Baker, our pet volcano in our backyard. And that's what we're here to talk about. What are we seeing? What is this all about? So I wanted to give you a background of the eruption history of Mount Baker so that we have some kind of context for what we're going to be talking about in the rest of this program. So here is a satellite view of Mount Baker right here. The ski area is right here at the end of the road. And to give you a sense of where we are, here's Glacier and then Baker Lake right over on the bottom right. So for this area has been volcanically active actually for quite a long time, but some of the areas that we see here are from about 2.5 million years, and there's some brown spots in here. I'm not sure if we can see them, but that's how old some of the older material we have here. One of the biggest events in the history of Mount Baker, and it's just off the side of Mount Baker, is the eruption of Culshan caldera 1.15 million years ago. And it seems incredibly long ago. Geologically, that ain't nothing. But this is where Culshan caldera sits, really close to where where the ski area is. This hasn't been after that for another 500,000 years. There were eruptions of this kind of green-colored material here that fill in some of the caldera and some of the outward regions, and the location of where the eruption was coming out, where that lava was coming out, or different products, migrated down to the southwest. At about 300,000 years ago, black buttes formed, and this is just what we see now is the remnants of a much bigger pile of lava and ash. But this is what we see today. Then, by about 140,000 years ago, that's when actually Mount Baker itself started to build up. So all of this other stuff is not Mount Baker. Most of what we see is just that is Mount Baker. The active part is just the very top bit of that, and it's only been active for about 140,000 years. More recently, actually I did want to point out these purple areas are lava flows that make up that bigger cone, the top cone of Mount Baker. We don't see it purple here because this is ice and we can't map underneath the ice. Presumably that would all be purple too, but we just can't see that. About 9,800 years ago, just after the ice age, the glaciers were retreating, a lava flow erupted here on the south flank in Sulphur Creek in Schreiber's Meadow. And 6,700 years ago, there was a large eruption from Sherman Crater. That was the last really large magmatic event that happened out in Mount Baker. So I wanted to give you an idea of what this looks like from town. So here we have Mount Baker itself. Presumably this is all lava flows from within that last 140,000 years. This is where we've mapped some of those lava flows. And this is that 300,000-year-old black buttes right here, this really craggy old rock. And then in front of it is other non-volcanic, we don't care about non-volcanic rocks, all that material. This is the most recent eruptive history within the last 12,000 years or so. And this is a timeline put together by the USGS and the Cascades Volcano Observatory, starting from about 12,000 years ago down to modern times right here. And so we've got Mount Baker, this is Baker Lake, we're looking to the northwest. And about 9,800 years ago was this cone formed and produced this cinder cone and produced this lava flow called the Sulphur Creek lava flow. So that was 9,800 years ago. About 6,700 years ago, there was a relatively large eruption of ash, the last magmatic eruption from Mount Baker, and it produced some really large debris flow deposits as well, lahar deposits. And then more recently, And this is we see that there's a big gap in the eruptive history until the last few hundred years, when we have a lot more resolution of when events occurred. In 1843, there was a hydrothermal blast that occurred at Sherman Crater, but it also produced large lahars that came down onto the east side, and those are mapped right down in here. Boulder Creek is right here. And then most recently was in 1975, there was an increase in the amount of gases that were coming out of Mount Baker that caused a lot of alarm, but it never did erupt. So it was just kind of burping a little bit. Just some gases coming out, but no magmatic eruptions. And so this is kind of the history of Mount Baker and the eruptive history of what we've seen. Most of what we've seen recently has been these kind of debris avalanches and material falling off of Mount Baker, whether they're associated with eruptions or not. So with that, I think I'll pass this off to Jackie Caplan-Auerbach, who will talk about volcanic hazards associated.
All right, so thanks very much, Pete. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hazards in general, so we can focus in on hazards on Baker itself. And some of the terms that Pete used, I'm going to flesh out a little bit. You may have heard of some of those before, but in case they're unfamiliar, hopefully this will kind of clarify. And I'm starting off just with a list of the types of hazards we might see at volcanoes broadly. And so, this is not necessarily specific to Baker. In fact, some of these are really unique to single volcanoes. But we're going to talk a little bit about lava flows, pyroclastic flows, things that what Pete mentioned called lahars or debris flows. I'll mention, volcanic ash. There are other hazards, for example, earthquakes and landslides and tsunamis and volcanic gas. And I'm kind of lumping those off separately because those tend to be either smaller hazards or unique to specific places. For example, Baker has no tsunami hazard because it's not near the water, whereas a volcano that is proximal to water might have a bigger issue there. So just with that in mind, go forward here. Okay, so we're going to come back to this as well, but this is a map put together by the USGS. In fact, I stole this very directly from Seth's talk here. You'll see it a few times. But these are maps that tell us kind of where we think places are at risk from different hazards. And I should point out that when I talk about a hazard, the hazard is the thing that can cause the problem. The risk is a different issue. The risk has to do not just with what that hazard might be, but what the actual effects might be. So these are the potential areas affected by these different hazards. And I'm going to come back to them so that you understand how to read these and we understand what a lahar is and what a pyroclastic flow is, etc. Pete showed something like this for Mount Baker, but I wanted to show, here's another example of one from the USGS for St. Helens. And the reason this is important is to some degree, not exclusively, but to some degree, volcanoes are creatures of habit. And so there are volcanoes that tend to erupt quite explosively. There are those that tend to be more, as Pete put it, effusive. They have a lot of lava flows. So we like to look at a volcano's history, as we just saw, to get some indication of what our hazards might be in the future. And mapping out where they are is a really critical part of that. So for example, here at St. Helens, we can see pyroclastic flow deposits, and there are, again, these things we call lahar deposits. So understanding what they've done is our question, so we can evaluate what the hazard might be. So I know that when I first thought about volcanoes when I was younger and hadn't studied them, this is sort of what I thought of. I thought of lava flows. I thought of, Pierce Brosnan and whatever volcano with, lava pouring down the mountain and him driving through it in that cool car and all that. So this is what, we see in these really runny, effusive lavas. And in this case, this is a photo of what's called pahoehoe. This is a basaltic lava. That is the type of lava that is most runny. And so, as Pete mentioned, the amount of gas really controls the type of eruption. But how easily that gas can escape is another part of it. This is a very runny lava. Gas, there's not a lot of gas in Kilauea to begin with, but it comes right on out, and you get these lovely lava flows. However, we can get really sticky lava flows as well. And again, if that lava is, in this case, instead of pouring out a soda, we're pouring out molasses, or we're pouring out something that's more viscous, we can get a lava flow like this Newberry flow. Whoops, let me go back there. Do we have a, yeah, we do. This little structure right here, not little, this is quite large. This is at Three Sisters. And this is a rhyolite flow, which is a very, very sticky flow. That would be a slower moving lava, but it's quite a thick and large event. And one of the reasons that's important, if it's super, super, super sticky, we can get something called a lava dome. This is what is regrowing inside the crater of Mount St. Helens right now. These are effectively lava flows, but they are so sticky that they don't really flow. They simply emplace in a near solid form as they come up. So all of this stuff is just lava, just stuff that's not really gassy. So one of the reasons that's important, lava can often, you can walk away from it. In the case of this one at Kilauea, they're not even looking, right? There's this lava flow coming across the road here, and these folks are like, yeah, whatever. Truly, lava is fairly easy to escape, but if you can't move something, then it is potentially a problem. So the kind of hazard we have here is for infrastructure. Now, in contrast, we also have things called pyroclastic flows, and these are actually some of the more deadly hazards that we see on volcanoes. This is an example of one from Mount Pinatubo in the 1990s. And this is basically an avalanche of hot rock. They move extremely quickly. They are basically just collapsed structures of, and let me see if I can figure out how to get this started on here. I don't know if I can do this on mine, and in fact, I want to kind of jump ahead. Well, we could just start showing this if we can figure out how to get this video going. And if it doesn't work, that's fine too. In theory, whoops. So in theory, there's a video, and we'll see if it comes up. But what we have is just to show a little bit of what this looks like. Again, it's an avalanche of hot rock. And these are just examples of how that rock comes down the mountain. So they move more quickly than you could either run or drive away from them. And again, they're exceptionally hot. So it's hard to see when it's gray like this. This video does show some footage of what it looks like at night when you can see it glowing red. So pyroclastic flows can be hazardous to both life and to infrastructure. We can go ahead, that's fine. I just wanted people to get a sense for how those things move. So I'll skim forward. I can go ahead and get to there. Okay. Nope, that's what I want. So one way we can understand what pyroclastic flows are like is to look at the deposits they leave behind. So for example, this is the bitter end of a flow on Mount St. Helens. And so you can see that not only are these hot and have ash within them, but they also contain large rocks. And so these are bits of pumice that were carried down within that. So even if the material within it isn't so hot as to cause problems, you really do have large clasts. Furthermore, you can have very thick deposits, if I can make this go forward. So this is an example from Redoubt Volcano, and what we have here is there's might be able to see a shovel for scale. It's a smaller shovel, but nonetheless, we're looking at several meters of deposit. So that a pyroclastic flow carries an enormous amount of material that can be problematic. So probably the deadliest of all volcanic hazards, surprisingly, does not always have to do with an eruption, does not have to do necessarily with lava. And this is something that we call a lahar. And a lahar it's simply a mud flow. Lahars, I'm also going to talk about the term debris flows just as being a smaller version of that same structure. Really, they are all mud flows, but sometimes when we talk about debris flows, what we mean are a smaller feature. People can commonly think of lahars as more deadly, but nonetheless, they are the same structure. One of the reasons we have these is volcanoes, as Pete mentioned, are covered with this sort of ashy material and rock. That stuff can be carried down the mountain in a mud flow. And of course, then that mud can cause, problems where it deposits. And so these are homes this is also the Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines. This can be something that occurs when the volcano is not erupting because that volcano is still covered in ash. And any kind of rainfall, certainly in the case of the Philippines, we have a very rainy season where that can be picked up again. So if I can see if I can, again, if I don't know if I can get to this link here. might be more, if we can kind of click on that link. This is an example of a lahar at Mount Ruapehu in New Zealand. And if it comes up, we can look at it again, not a big deal if we can't. If we click on the link, does anything come up? No, it's fine. It's fine, we can move on. Well, okay, if we can kind of bounce sort of, you can see what that flow looks like here. It's a very muddy structure, and it really often has the consistency of cement. So it's not the kind of thing that is easy to avoid. So I wanted to show this one. This is quite a long video, and we'll just watch a little bit of it. But one of the critical aspects of this one in particular, this was a flow that came down, number one, when Ruapehu was not erupting. Ruapehu has a summit crater lake that breached. It breached the top, it was rising, and it came over the top of the rim of the lake. It came down a river called the Whangehu. And what was important about this is that in 1959, a lahar had come down the Whangehu River and took out a bridge on which a train was currently traveling, and it killed quite a few people. And so the emergency services in New Zealand were well aware that this was a potential hazard again. And they had a monitoring system in place. So when this started to come down the Whangehu again in 2007, they were aware it was coming. They had, by that point, built a berm to keep the mud from flowing into the water system. And they were able, because they knew it was coming, to shut down any train or traffic activity going over it. What's important here is that we know where lahars are going to go. They go downstream valleys, so we know what areas are at risk from them. We can go ahead and go back. And thank you for driving the computer there. Maybe we can go back. Yeah, perfect. Okay. And maybe I can even just advance from there. So I bring this up because we're going to see that lahar is probably one of our more significant hazards here at Baker. And there we go. I'll cruise forward. No, hopefully we can get right through to there. This is the hazard of trying to get fancy with your, okay. So just examples of things. Here's a little debris flow that took place on Mount Baker. You might be able to see just this little bit of mud kind of coming down from, this is again Sherman Crater up here, a little bit of debris flowing down here that actually can come into a stream valley as well. That's a small feature, but sometimes they really carry some significant material. And again, this is from Mount Baker just a few years ago. There was some rock and gravel mobilized that came down to they believe, the middle fork of the Nooksack. So you can carry structures like this down with them. So those, again, can happen when the volcano is not erupting. It just picks up material that's there now. So this is actually a lahar deposit from Mount Baker. This is an older deposit, and I regret I don't know which one this is. But what you're looking at here, this whole structure, and here's a ice axe for scale. So again, you've got several meters of material that was emplaced by one of these. And so this is one of the things that we look at the history of the volcano to see what might happen again in the future. So volcanic ash is another one that you may think of. Certainly for those of you who were here in 1980 when Mount St. Helens erupted, you know that volcanic ash blanketed a good portion of the state. So ash is just those tiny fragments of rock that come out when the gas exalts from the magma and it tears that soda into little bits of sugar water. This is your volcanic sugar water, these little tiny bits of rock. This is a photo from that St. Helens eruption, and this was quite some distance away, but it is carried very far. So this can fall out in small quantities in the far field or in large quantities in the near field. So here's Papua New Guinea in the Rabaul eruption in the 1980s, and you can see that there's a substantial amount of ash that fell out of that eruption. And we have to remember that when we think of ash, we think of the kind of material that's very fine. Maybe you have it in your fireplace, but really, it's rock. And so it is covering this thing with a substantial portion of rock, and it can cause collapse of structures because of the weight of that rock. So I just want to really quickly mention gas. Pete talked about this. There are some volcanoes at which gas can be a hazard in itself. That is really not the case for Baker unless you go stick your face into the fumaroles. That really this is not something we worry about, but it's a nice indicator from time to time of what the volcano might be doing. So with all that, we put all these together and we look at what things we might expect at Baker. And so what you can see here is that, I don't know if you can read from way in the back, But we have these sort of near volcano hazards, lava and pyroclastic flows. So now we know what those are. And really the only area that is at significant hazard or at risk from those hazards is very close to the volcano itself. However, we have these orange and yellow, and in some cases red areas that have a more significant risk from lahars. So these are stream valleys because we know that's where those flows will head downhill. So really, this gives us a sense for what our risk is and for what we need to prepare. And so with that in mind, I think I'm going to turn this over now to Seth Moran and let him talk about what the Cascades Volcano Observatory is doing to help us prepare for this stuff.
Okay, well, first off, thank you all for coming out today. This is a great thing to see a community so interested in learning about a hazard and thinking about how to be prepared for it. And the second thing I want to say that Jackie didn't mention is that Pierce Brosnan in Dante's Peak played a USGS scientist. So I bring you greetings from the southwestern corner of our fair state and also from the folks at the Cascades Volcano Observatory. And I thought I'd spend a few minutes just taking a 30,000-foot view upwards of what that group is. And so this is a photo of all of us. We're about 65 people in the building, not all focused on the Cascades, but all focused on the questions of volcano hazards, understanding them better, understanding what volcanoes can do, and also thinking about monitoring and community preparedness. And there's a whole variety of types of scientific areas of expertise that you need to have to work on a volcano. You've got to have geologists, you've got to have the seismologists, which are Pete and Jackie and me, but there's also hydrologists and geochemists and computer programmers, remote sensors, people look at deformation, geodesists, and things like that, as well as, very critically, administrators for helping us with red tape. And so that's all the folks that are in that building. We were born in May 18, 1980. There was no Cascades Volcano Observatory before Mount St. Helens erupted. And we were officially anointed in 1982, and primarily, initially, we're focused on Mount St. Helens, but especially over the last 2 decades have been really broadening the reach to include all of the Cascades. And this is our quote-unquote turf, Washington and Oregon, and those triangles correspond to places where magma has come out of the ground in the last 10,000 years, and there is CVO, just for reference, we're just right next to Portland. The colors of those triangles correspond to the relative risk that each poses to communities. And so Pete and Jackie both have already talked about what risk is, which is a combination of the hazard, what the volcano can do, and the exposure to society in terms of how close are people to those volcanoes. So the red colors are the volcanoes that are the highest risk or highest threat, relatively speaking, in Washington and Oregon. There's 8 of them. This is part of a nationwide study that was done about a decade ago that looked at 160 or so volcanic centers throughout the United States and ranked them relatively using those 2 factors, hazard and exposure. And 18 of those 160 were ranked in the very highest threat volcano category, 8 of which are in the Pacific Northwest. And you'll already have noticed that Mount Baker is one of those. This is just saying what I just said. There's 25 places where magma's come out of the ground in the last 10,000 years. On average, there's 2 eruptions per century, somewhere in the Cascades, most likely at Mount St. Helens, but somewhere else. Mount Hood erupted in 1781. And so putting that into a relative risk perspective, the Cascadia event, the magnitude 9 that has been talked about a lot and for very, very good reason, that's about once every 450 to 500 years. And so in between, though, there's going to be 9 or 10 of these cascade eruptions. And eruptions are, in general, much lower consequence. Even Mount St. Helens in 1980 is a lower consequence event than the magnitude 9 earthquake will be. But they're still major events, even eruptions that are smaller, a lot smaller than Mount St. Helens in 1980. And one example of that was Mount St. Helens erupted again in 2004, building that lava dome that Jackie was talking about. That was almost a 0 consequence event unless you were working in the crater, and which we were, and so there were some issues that we were focusing on. But But when it woke up, the media attention, I don't know how many of you remember that, but it was nuts. For about 3 weeks, we had 24/7 coverage. We had Geraldo camping out on the pumice plain waiting to catch that eruption. And there were miles of people parked along the road up to Mount St. Helens to try and catch the explosion. So that by itself was a huge deal that people like John had to deal with no eruption, or a very zero consequence eruption. In terms of how we do our work, there's research, there's monitoring, and there's community preparedness. All those three are sort of the primary pillars that we've learned are needed to be able to do the job. And the community preparedness part of it is something that 35 years ago, 40 years ago, scientists didn't have as much an appreciation of the importance of. That all changed in 1985. There was an eruption in Colombia, in the Nevado del Ruiz, that produced a lahar. The scientists, the monitoring network picked it up. The scientists knew it was happening. It was actually a volcano that had been in unrest for a while. But word didn't get to the folks that were in the way of this lahar. They had 2 hours to hear about it. And in the end, over 20,000 people died. And that was a pretty big wake-up call for the scientific community. And ever since then, we've taken this community preparedness part very seriously. It's very important for people to know who the scientists are, what this weird language is that we use, lahar, what's that? That's an Indonesian word for mud flow. Also understanding who the stakeholders are, who the emergency responders are, and that universe is different for every volcano. So partners are huge in all this, and we work with other federal agencies, we work with state agencies, we work with county agencies, we work with academics, and other folks as well. And that's just what we've learned. This is what we need to be doing. Okay, so now to the monitoring, to focusing in on Mount Baker. So this is where we are with the Cascade volcanoes, and just call your attention to Mount St. Helens, which is our poster child for a really well-monitored volcano. 20 seismometers, 20 GPS instruments, which are just like what all of us have in our cell phones, except the GPS is anchored to the ground, and so it can register movements as little as about a ½ an inch. And that's really important because ground deformation can be very subtle. So Mount St. Helens is well monitored. Mount Rainier up here is, it's okay, it's pretty good, but it's not, could be better. But Mount Baker is pretty clearly not in very good shape. 2 seismometers, 0 GPS. Glacier Peak, 1 seismometer, 0 GPS. There's some good reasons for that. One is that they're hard places to work. Another is that they're both in wilderness, and wilderness has some very strict regulations in terms of accessing those volcanoes. Another reason why we have so many at Mount St. Helens is that it's erupted twice. So if these volcanoes had erupted in the last 30 years, they would be in better shape. And like I said before, CVO has kind of rolled itself out as focusing on St. Helens first, and then we've been expanding outwards. And Mount Rainier is one where there's very clearly a local hazard issue with lahars that have happened fairly recently. It won't come as much of a surprise, perhaps, that those 2 seismometers have not picked up a lot of earthquakes. This is a map going back to 1990. Each of these little dots here is an earthquake that occurred, and the colors aren't really important. It's different time periods. But you can see around Mount Baker, there's not a whole lot, and you have to go out a little ways to see earthquakes that are located. It's one of the interesting questions with Mount Baker. Why do we see so few earthquakes, especially when, conversely, it's the volcano that produces the highest amount of volcanic gas of any Cascade volcano when they're not erupting. The volcanic gas is mostly carbon dioxide. It's not a ton, but it's interesting. It produces this gas, but not a lot of earthquakes, or actually almost none. And so it actually arguably has the lowest seismicity rate of any Cascade volcano. Now, part of that could easily be this is poor network there, and we're not seeing the small earthquakes that we're seeing at Mount St. Helens. At Mount St. Helens, we can locate earthquakes negative magnitude 1 or lower. We can't do that at Mount Baker. So that's just kind of an interesting question as far as whether we've established the baseline. But the important thing about monitoring is to establish what's normal for a volcano. And then when we see perturbations, we have a better sense of what we're dealing with. So if we have a poor sense of that baseline, then when something pops up, we don't really know, is this unusual? Is this in the realm of possibility for something that might not lead to an eruption? So our present focus, we are aware that the monitoring situation, not just at Mount Baker, but other volcanoes, is not ideal. Our present focus is to get all volcanoes that are red up to at least a baseline OK threshold, which would be about 4 to 6 instruments. And where we're focused right now is at Mount Hood, and I put dates here for when we think we'll be installing stations there. And then second is going to be up here at Glacier Peak, which is 2020, 2021. And those are both permitting processes that are in progress. And a lot depends on whether those permit processes are ultimately successful. Mount Baker will be next after that, and this is a ballpark timeline. We've already been looking to see if we could find places to put sites. One of the difficulties of Mount Baker, as Jackie mentioned, there's lots of ice, and it's hard to find places to put things that will last year-round, which is the goal. And so we've got a couple stages here where we'll test how you get data out, and then begin the permitting process about 3 years from now, and installations probably 3 or 4 years after that. It's about a 3 or 4 year permitting process right now. If the volcano wakes up and we don't have the instruments that we need out there, we do have a sort of stopgap solution that depends very heavily on good weather, and that's what we call a spider. This is something that we developed in 2004 for Mount St. Helens. When we lost some instruments in the crater, it wasn't safe for us to go out and put instruments where we wanted them, and so we developed this platform that you can take up by a helicopter. You put it on a sling line. It has a seismometer, it's got a GPS right there, there's a lightning detector for if there's ash, and infrasound for catching explosions in the air. So this would be something that we would try to put out on a clear day, of which there are not many in the winter. So the goal is to get real-time monitoring in place. So now there's this interesting question of unrest versus eruption. And I mentioned before that, that there's unrest happens, and one of our goals of monitoring is to get baselines to understand where we are. So just going to sort of walk through a couple of statements. So Mount Baker hasn't erupted in thousands of years, but there have been 2 recent periods of unrest. There was the 1843 explosion that Pete mentioned, and then there was the steaming, the increase in temperatures as well in 1975. Globally, we know that volcanoes have that kind of unrest, seismic crises, increase in gassing without producing eruptions. And so it's, the problem with that is that they don't leave a geologic record, so we don't have a good sense of how frequently that has happened at Mount Baker, except for these 2 instances that we have now. But it's probably likely that there'll be more of those. In fact, that I would say is the most likely thing to happen at Mount Baker is that we'll get unrest. And that unrest may not lead to an eruption. But like I mentioned with St. Helens, that unrest is going to be a big deal by itself. So this kind of an event is a really important event. It's not like we have to wait 6,000 more years for an eruption. We will get something that will test our preparedness in terms of our ability to communicate and our ability to react appropriately. And that includes the scientists. So when unrest occurs, we're not initially going to know where it's going to go. That's just a statement of fact. That's the case with every eruption. So that, there will be a major media event, and even if there's no eruption that occurs, that will be a major event, that will be disruptive. And improved monitoring networks will definitely improve our ability to determine where unrest is going. But there's still going to be uncertainty, just like there is with weather forecasts today. And what we need for folks is to be able to roll with us a bit on that. We'll have much more than just a random guess. It will be an educated statement about what we think is going on, but there's still going to be uncertainty. And working towards community preparedness is what we can do now. And so the last couple of things I want to spend time on is what we're doing in terms of the community preparedness side of things. First is that the USGS has standardized our alert language that we use across the nation. So Hawaii uses this, Alaska uses this, and it's the same language as the Weather Service uses. We have this normal advisory watch warning, which for aviation land, for ash in the air is green, yellow, orange, red. And so right now all the Cascade volcanoes are at normal green, and they've been that way for a long time. If you're interested in getting those kinds of statements or our weekly updates, you can sign up at this website, which I know you're probably not going to write down because it's a lot of letters. But you can also just search on USGS Volcano Alert System, and you should get Googled to the place where you can sign up and get these, and then be in the know as quickly as Geraldo. Something else that we're doing is with these simplified hazard maps that Jackie showed a couple times. This is to make the geologic information that goes into these hazards assessments somewhat easier to understand. And Jackie mentioned this before. This pink area is the near field place where things like lava, pyroclastic flows. The basic idea of this is that this is a place where warning really can't be provided. If you're there, the volcano's restless, we can't get warning to you much faster than about a half hour, if at all. And so this is just not a good place to be. And as opposed to these other zones where there'll be more warning, more time, more things to think about. We also have outreach materials. There's a Mount Baker fact sheet that's in the back of the room over here. I brought a bunch with me. There's also fact sheets for Glacier Peak, if you're interested, that just talk about summarized information that Pete put together about the eruption history and the hazards that Jackie mentioned. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the coordination plan that has been a process that's involved a number of stakeholders for over a decade. This is for Mount Baker and Glacier Peak. And the thing I want to leave you with, this is a plan that's not, it's a good way to go to sleep if you want to read it at night, because there's a lot of really dry prose, but it's got the prose that you need when an unrest event happens. It describes who is at the table and who needs to be coordinated with and who needs to be communicated with and how those communications will happen. This table shows the list of all the folks that have been involved in putting together this plan. And the main thing, the thing that's awesome about this is that all of these agencies, all of these groups have been talking with each other. And so they know each other, they know about the hazard, know about some of the different parameters. And so when Mount Baker has unrest again, we're not going to be starting from ground zero. And that hopefully should help all of you feel a little bit better about where your agencies are in terms of being ready for this the next time Mount Baker has unrest. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Rebekah.
So we're going to look at the potential impacts of a Mount Baker lahar. This is part of a little bit of research that some students and I have been looking at as part of a planning exercise with John Gargett and Whatcom County Emergency Management. And what that exercise is all about is let's plan out what's going to happen, let's pretend it's actually happening, and go through the motions to see if we are prepared. And one of the things that is of particular concern is communications across the border with Canada. So the focus of the scenario that that my students looked at was a lahar that went down the middle fork of the Nooksack and then veered up through Deming, then up through Everson, and then up through Sumas, and then miraculously stopped right at the border. Because we don't need to worry about anything that happens north of the border. And so what the students were doing was looking at, okay, if we have a lahar flow in this area, who's impacted? How much resources do we have in these areas? But what I want to point out is I'm going to tell you the numbers for this particular scenario, but do note that we are not talking about a lahar flow that's going on the North Fork, which would hit Glacier, Maple Falls, Kendall, and a lot of population centers. We're also not talking about a scenario that continues down through Linden and then down into Ferndale and out into the bay. So we can sort of imagine and extrapolate out from the numbers that we're going to get here for a larger scenario. Okay, so first off, private property. Looking at that scenario, they found that there are 7,000 properties in a lahar flow that goes down the middle fork, through Deming, up through Everson, and through this Nooksack, or up through to Sumas. Over 100,000 acres are in that assessed lahar path, and that's particularly challenging because that's a lot of people and it's a lot of property in the way. In particular, there are houses, there are farms, there are outbuildings. There are some movable materials, such as farm equipment and livestock, that with proper planning and with sufficient warning, that material could be moved out of the Lahar path. But there's going to be a lot of stuff that's just stuck. We can't move it, and so that is definitely at risk. So homes and furniture and that sort of thing. Particularly of note is that there are 2,000 members of the Nooksack tribe that are in this Lahar path. And they are in a particularly difficult situation because their traditional territory is within this Lahar path, and there's no way for them as a tribe to sort of move someplace else. In this area, the population looks like it's somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people that are directly in the Lahar path. And based on that Lahar path flow, there's another several thousand people that could potentially be behind a Lahar path, not in it, so not directly at risk, but trapped. And either in need of evacuation beforehand or in need of rescue afterwards. This is an area of strong agriculture, and there are nearly 1,000 agricultural parcels in the assessed path. Many of these are dairy farms, about 60% are dairy farms, and the 40% that remain are a mix, but quite a few of them are berry farmers. Agricultural fields are often in Lahar paths because that's an area of really, geologically speaking, that's an area with really great soil. So it's not odd that this is a large sector here, but it's a sector that's going to be really challenged in a Lahar event. Livestock and machinery can be moved. Some of it can be moved, but that's a challenge. Where are you going to take tens of thousands of livestock if we need to do an evacuation of this area and we have some warning? Where are they going to go? And how are we going to make sure that they can be kept alive and cared for, not just for when the event happens, but for quite some time after? It may be years, if not decades, of litigation, of monitoring activity before the county and the state will allow people to return to their areas. It would have to be resurveyed. People wouldn't even know where their area was anymore. And then even if, miraculously, we could get back in these areas again, there's going to be woody debris, unconsolidated soils, hazardous materials, debris from everything that has flowed down that it's going to be very difficult to reestablish any kind of agriculture. So these agricultural plots are going to have to really think through what is their long-term strategy here. It will have a national impact on the frozen raspberry trade because Whatcom County produces about 60% of that trade. So it will be a boon for other areas and their raspberries. There's also some considerable impacts when we talk about critical infrastructure. Well, the scenario that we were looking at, going down the Middle Fork and then heading north, does not flow down into the south and flow down into Skagit. There's still some concern about the dams in the lower Baker Dam and the upper Baker Dam. The explosion itself could trigger massive sort of landslide type events on the Baker Dam area and slide into the lake, causing a failure of the dam. And even if it's just ash falling into the lake itself, a big thick slurry of ash on the surface of that lake could gum up all of the turbines for Puget Sound energy and cause significant impacts to the electrical resources or the electrical supply in the state or in Western Washington. We also have some utilities of concern. The Northwest Pipeline up in Sumas is where natural gas coming down through Canada is split off and distributed to several western states. That pipeline facility and the splitting facility is right on the border and is in the Lahar Path. It would be potentially buried. And while the facilities managers there say their first priority would be digging that out and restarting it, I think they may underestimate what digging out of a lahar actually means. That said, with sufficient warning, they would likely divert the pipeline or the supply of fuel around the potential impact zone, and there would continue to be gas distributed to the western United States, but there would be a loss of economy, a loss of jobs, and a loss of local sourcing of natural gas from that distribution. And while gas could still flow, I mean, they may have their head in a lahar sand a little bit, but they think that, okay, the pipes are underground, and so the lahar is going to be on top, and it's not really going to be an impact. The problem is they won't be able to access the pipelines, and long-term, if you can't access your infrastructure, it's not much use. The other issues of concern is we have sewage treatment plants. Specifically for this lahar path, we have sewage treatment plants in Everson that would be inundated and no longer functional. If the lahar were to extend down and go down sort of the Linden, down through Ferndale route, we have 2 additional sewage treatment plants that would be knocked offline, causing widespread disruption, water and sewage disruption, not just in the immediate impact zone, but to the people who are serviced by those utilities. We would also have significant impacts to transportation. Over 100 miles of roadway and 36 bridges are directly in the lahar path and would directly be completely knocked offline. That includes 5 state highways, but in particular, it's the networking of these transportation systems that's particularly challenging. This lahar path would block access, road access and rail access to anything east of Deming. So all of the Kendall, Mayville Valley, Glacier, the ski resort, all of that is no longer accessible. And Highway 9, which goes from Sumas down through Happy Valley and then down into Skagit, becomes inaccessible, and places like Van Zandt no longer have their northern access route. 70 county roadways and over 70 county roads in particular are also impacted by this. And then my favorite personal topic is the schools. Here's our lahar flow coming this way. There are 5 schools in this area that are directly in the lahar path. That is particularly challenging. If it's a low warning event, that's very, very concerning, because we're going to need to be able to evacuate those schools, and those schools are going to need to know how to evacuate effectively and efficiently. But even with lots of warning and evacuating the area, that's a lot of students. 2,000 students would need to be educated elsewhere in the county, and we would have to creatively work together as a county to absorb those students into other schools, and do so in a way that didn't disrupt their education and created a welcoming environment for them, and did not create social dislocation and tension between the accepting school and the incoming students. This is an area of high natural resources and recreation. There's lots of foresting and mining activities out in this lahar area, and there's a lot of recreational activities out in this lahar area. And the one that is sort of near and dear to many people in the county is we've got a ski resort there, but we also have Ski to See. This brings in 4,000 participants and many, many more tourists into our area, and is a cultural icon for our area. It's hard to do Ski to See after an eruption. We'd have to reinvent ourselves on that front. So thinking forward about recovery, it's really hard to think through what's going to happen, and John is going to spend some more time on what they're doing on this front. So I'm just going to pick out a few things. We've done this before. We've done this with Mount Baker, and I've lost the top half of my slide, but the left column is the Mount St. Helens eruption and the impacts there, and then some of the numbers we have from this scenario assessment. So when Mount St. Helens erupted, 200 homes were damaged. The assessment of a middle fork going north, Lahar for Mount Baker, is 7,000 parcels. 8 bridges were impacted in Mount St. Helens. 36 are expected to be impacted by this one scenario that we looked at, which is not even the worst case scenario. Certainly a scenario going down into Skagit Valley is of even greater concern. Ashfall from Mount St. Helens stranded 5,000 people. It caused 57 deaths from surprising reasons. Certainly there were some people that were in the actual impact zone, but people also died of heart attacks trying to shovel the ash. People also died of traffic accidents because of the low visibility. Some people died when crop dusters weren't able to see and they crashed into power lines. So there's all kinds of strange things that happen in these volcanic eruptions that may affect many of us who are not actually living in the actual impact zone. But looking at all of that, Mount St. Helens was assessed as $1 billion in losses in 1981. That's about $3 billion in losses today. We don't know how expensive a Mount Baker eruption would be, but the sort of back of the envelope estimate is somewhere around 10 billion. And you can see that 10 billion might even be low because the scale, I mean, we're jumping quite a bit in terms of the potential impact. And of that 3 billion, about half of it was carried by the feds, and then the other half was distributed between losses to private property and distributed to losses to state and local. So this is going to be expensive. That said, recovery does happen. When these events happen, it feels like it's this cataclysmic event that is all-encompassing, and for a little while it is, and certainly for people who are directly impacted, the stress and the sense of powerlessness is extreme and needs to be addressed. But recovery does happen. 35 years after Mount St. Helens, we have the start of ecological recovery being monitored down there. It was only a couple years before the region redefined itself and said, well, we just had a volcano erupt. Let's make a visitor center. Let's bring in all the people who are interested in the tourism, and let's capitalize on this incredible geologic event that happened in our area. I would expect something similar would happen here. More recently, Castle Rock, a town down near Mount St. Helens, is now capitalizing on the sediment deposits. And they are bringing in a great revenue to their city coffers by selling the sediment left over by Mount St. Helens eruption. So surprising and new and different economies emerge. It's not necessarily a return to the economy that was there before, but we don't know what it's going to look like. I'm going to assume that's not important unless somebody stands up and tells us it is. And lastly, I'm going to throw up some slides here. This is from a different type of event entirely. but it speaks to the human spirit and to resilience. This is in Christchurch, New Zealand. They had a major earthquake that devastated their downtown. Their downtown was on unconsolidated, liquefiable soil, and after the earthquake, at least 50% of their downtown had to be torn down, and it wasn't an area where they could economically rebuild. And when it first happened, it looked like it was going to be the death toll of the downtown, and in some senses it was, but something interesting has emerged. As buildings were torn down, the sides of the buildings that remained became these blank canvases, and a really interesting artistic expression came out of that, where now the sides of buildings in the downtown are covered with graphic art, and beautiful art at that. And it is now a site where people actually come to come do these city-scale art walks. They also started using shipping containers to build little, there's a coffee shop made out of a little shipping container. There's little stores, the shipping containers stacked on top of each other. The creativity that emerged out of this event is quite phenomenal. And what is recovering, and this is true in every case of disaster, is not a return to what it was before, but something new and different, and with enough planning, with enough preparedness, and especially enough social connection in a community. These events, while incredibly devastating, can be events where people come together and resiliently reinvent themselves. And I'll turn it over to John.
While he's bringing up the slides, I just want to really express my appreciation to the colleagues that are up here at the table, because a lot of what I'm talking about isn't even possible if it isn't for the work at USGS. One of Seth's colleagues, Cynthia Gardner, is working with us on our exercise this fall. Jackie's work has been going on, has been great. Pete, thanks. Rebekah, your work's been great, and the students have been fantastic to work with. So give them a hand if you would again, please. And not to mention the VMC and everybody else, but I know we'll give them a big hand later, but I do want to point out two people that are in the audience that really make a big difference in Whatcom County for emergency management, and that's Shalise Du Johnson in the back. Shalise, would stand. There's Shalise. And Francis Burkhart, who also works in our office. Francis was part of the international group that went down to Colombia a few years ago to study volcanoes, so she's certainly somebody we rely on heavily. But I want to talk about preparing Whatcom County now because, you know, I'm not a scientist. In case you didn't notice, I'm the only one without a doctor in front of my name here. So I have to rely on the expertise of the experts to be able to understand. But what does this all mean to Whatcom County? I think that's what's really, really important because it's about our small communities. And it's about what's going to happen within Whatcom County. Rebekah did talk about some of the impacts. This is Sumas about in 1885, I think is when that was. And, you know, it's really a neat picture. I like old pictures myself. We got family that were living there about then and everything. But, you know, what's the big deal about Sumas? Well, probably not much, a lot of people say. But well, I had relatives there. Now, come on, don't be laughing at that. That's built on the Lahar. So that event 6,600 years ago, which you've heard reference to here for that Lahar, this is about 12 feet deep. So, you know, about 3 meters deep, according to Cynthia and USGS and some of the studies that have been done there. Because when that lahar came down the middle fork and decided to turn right at Everson, you know, it headed right on up the valley, and it did, in fact, cross the border and go all the way to the Fraser River. There is some suggestions, just to give you an idea of the impact of what that kind of an event could be, and I'm not a scientist, but that changed the course of the Nooksack River, which used to be a tributary, or so it's believed, into the Fraser River, and that this actually changed it to its present course where it is today. So these can, as Rebekah mentioned, have long-lasting and substantial impacts and changing the way that we deal with our environment. And we are living with an active volcano, so we have to remember that. So in addition to Sumas, we also have Everson, we have the city of Nooksack, we've got the town of Deming, we've got the Nooksack Indian tribe, as Rebekah mentioned, Mosquito Lake area, that whole Mosquito Lake Road area. All that area, just sort of take your pencil if that eruption that event happened again, and just erase all of that. Because when you go down, once you get to Deming, you know, if you've driven up there, it's all flat in the valley there. It's really pretty, and then the foothills go up. That's the lahar. When you get into the Sumas Prairie area, they call it, which is from basically Nugent's Corner all the way up to the Fraser River, that's all perfectly flat. That's all lahar, or at least according to David Tucker, who's perhaps one of the better lahar experts here in Whatcom County. So those communities are all at risk, as well as the farms, the agriculture, and so forth. So the impact that Rebekah was talking about with all those residents, that's in reality what we're talking about. That's where those 10,000 people come from, plus Maple Falls, plus Peaceful Valley, plus the ski area, because that event would literally cut them off on both sides. So they couldn't go up to Sumas and drive up the back road, and they couldn't go up Mount Baker Highway. When you talk about the impacts, not of the lahar, but the impacts of the event that would impact other communities, that at right about, everybody know where Highway 9 meets the Mount Baker Highway there? If not, it's right there by the town of Deming. And we have a railroad bridge which brings all the rail cars from Canada down south. Generally they're empty, but it's a big loop for the railroads. That would be eliminated. The bridge itself on Highway 9 would be eliminated. So the transportation impact, those bridges don't get rebuilt very often, or very quickly rather. And so the towns of Acme and Van Zandt and so on would suffer tremendous economic impacts as a result. So we're going to be holding a series of workshops. I should say, in October of this year, the Sheriff's Office Division of Emergency Management is doing a full-scale exercise to go through this same event that occurred, this lahar event, and react as if it really were to occur again. So one of those efforts, the first things we're going to do is a series of small community workshops in each of these communities and make sure that people that living in the communities understand how the warning will occur, which really comes from USGS, the National Weather Service. We'll be putting together how, if you live in Peaceful Valley and you have to evacuate, or Maple Falls, because of a potential eruption, what about the security of your property? That all has to be taken into account. It's not like an earthquake that happens and then you immediately start cleaning up. As Cynthia Gardner from USGS says, lahars and volcanoes are the gifts that keep on giving, because it's not over after it happens. It can go on for years and years. Another aspect is that we really have to rely on interagency response and coordination. This is what we want to avoid, and for those that can't read it, the gentleman is banging on a drum there, and it says, what was he doing? He was testing the new federally funded lahar early warning system. Why did he stop? Because he probably didn't know how to spell lahar. Now, that's tongue-in-cheek, of course, but it is important that we're all on the same page when it comes to interagency response and coordination. And Specifically on warning systems, there are no warning systems other than we're going to rely on USGS to tell us the mountain is acting up, and we've got the Weather Service to get things out, but we don't have any LAHAR sirens or warning sirens like they have in Pierce County for Mount Rainier or anything like that. But the whole point of interagency response and coordination is to make sure that we're all in sync together. So as early as we can find out that something's happening from USGS, we can begin to get the word out to the public, which is what we do. And it goes well beyond that as well, because when you start talking about interagency response and coordination, all of a sudden, as Seth showed us on his slides, there were about 20 people listed on that Mount Baker coordination plan. We just finished doing the analysis of the agencies that would be involved if this were to occur in Whatcom County. And that's about nearly 80 different agencies. And they're agencies you don't always think about, but again, we're trying to get ahead of the curve and trying to make sure that we're at least talking with everybody to make sure things are coordinated. And when we do this, we'll have a tabletop exercise, we call it. And that means we'll be all getting in a room and we'll be presenting them with the different kinds of problems that will occur. Like who's in charge of a volcano? You know, I mean, that's kind of a tough question to answer. Because if Mount Baker were to erupt, it's not like Whatcom County Fire District 14 is going to be in charge of it, because it's a little bit beyond what they have. And by the way, 14 is a great fire district, by the way. Anybody live there? Tell Jerry I said he does a great job. But it's simply too massive and too big. But to think the federal government's going to come in and manage it, they're too big, and they don't even know where Whatcom County is in a lot of cases. They think it's in Washington State, and I'm not kidding. Well, that's another story. But in any event, it's somewhere in between. It's not the smallest agency, it's not the biggest agency. The coordination plan, which Seth talked about, is the cornerstone that begins that process. But we do need to pull in the fire districts, we do need to pull in the sheriff's office, we do need to pull in the Everson Police and Public Works, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where that list gets quite large. So we are literally defining in this exercise this year, how is that going to look like and what's it going to look like? And oh, by the way, it also includes Canada, because the volcano doesn't stop at the border and would have impacts. Chilliwack, Abbotsford, Lower Mainland, it can really have a large impact. So they're also part of it. But because it's another country, you know, we have to coordinate with them. Let me just leave it at that, because we can't actually consider them part of our response forces, if you will. Another group that's real important in any time you've got an emergency are the elected officials. What are you laughing at? No, that's, of course, the Roman Senate. But one of the things is the elected officials, they actually set the policies. So they're the ones that actually have to approve things ahead of time and or make tough decisions that we present problems to them for. So we're having another workshop with the elected officials, and by the way, that includes not just the local officials, and that's as far down as the local school boards. Rebekah talked about the Mount Baker and Nooksack school districts that are right smack in the middle of the Lahar. They have school boards that are elected. They're invited to that. All the way on as the fire district commissioners, Whatcom County Council, our state officials, state elected officials. The governor's office has a big role in volcano coordination plan. They're invited. The two people, though, that I've been a little surprised that are invited and plan to come at this point is Senator Marie Cantwell, who, by the way, is a big supporter of volcano preparedness and had introduced a bill which did not pass about getting more sensors up in the mountain. So we're really pleased about that. As well as our congressional delegation. They're also interested, well, they're planning on coming. Susan Delbenny's office has it on her schedule already. So we're really happy about that. But like all other things, we want to make sure that just because we have Congresswoman and a senator there, that they're not didactically talking to everybody like they're in charge and making sure that the school board commissioners have as much input as all of them, because it takes a collaborative effort to put it together and be able to respond. But they're the ones that make the decision, like, okay, Sheriff, you can go ahead and shut down this, or you now need to get this evacuated. And they have to get the prosecuting attorneys and all the attorneys to agree that these are all legal things that need to be occurring. So that's what happens here in Whatcom County. Elected officials are critically important in that process. Now, command, control, coordination, and communications is a whole nother area altogether. We talked about interagency response and coordination, and that's certainly something that we want to make sure that we have in place, but then you got to make it all work. And that's what this command, control, coordination, and communications is all about. Now, I'd like to say that there's a war room, like from this Dr. Strangelove movie, war room picture, and they're all sitting there and everything works out perfectly, but there's a lot of little things that can come up, such as simplistic as there's 37 different radio systems in Whatcom County. So literally to be able to have the Sumas Police Department talk to us at the Sheriff's Office, for example, that's 2 different radio systems on 4 different frequencies, one federal and encrypted and the other not. So, you know, these may not sound like big deals, but that's why we want to get together and make sure that it all does in fact work. This will be the full scale portion of the exercise. So we'll actually be taking our equipment, and I know we have the amateur radio operators, some of our group there in the back. Actually, all the volunteers here today are going to be involved in this one way or the other, if it was real or in the exercise. But they all play a role in this and are critically important in being involved with it. So we'll be ensuring that we all work together through the real full-scale play. Full-scale means we're going out and actually doing it. And one of those things that we're going to be doing, for example, is we have a communications van which has satellite connectivity to it. So we'll be going to these different communities and actually ensuring that we know how to use this fancy equipment and that it actually does in fact work. And we'll be doing different things throughout the entire exercise. So we're going to want to know, for example, okay, if we order an evacuation in Whatcom County, what does that mean? Who's going to be handling security? Okay, you said you're going to post police. Where are you going to post them? Where are people going to be staged? Where are the people that live there going to be moving? That's another part, actually, in a volcano that's nice, is generally, you get, at least with Mount Baker, I think it's safe to say we'll probably have some notice at least. It's not going to be something that, all of a sudden, boom, the mountain goes and we've got it. It can happen, but generally we're going to have some notice. So where do we relocate those 10,000 people? And when do we order them out of there? And actually, the Mount Baker Forest, that whole area, is actually under the control of the U.S. Forest Service. So they may decide earlier on, in conjunction with Geological Survey and others, hey, you know what, we're just going to close the forest. Well, if they just decide to do that, then we've shut down the ski area, then we've shut down all the recreation that was talked about. So that could be positive in the sense that you're getting people out of there, be negative in terms of an economic impact. One of those other components as part of that command and control is search and rescue. And search and rescue, we're actually pretty excited about this. I did have the ability, I started my career with Mount St. Helens, and search and rescue was the area that we were working on. And there was a lot of confusion initially in those first few days, not surprisingly, by the way, about what that looked like. But you have search and rescue people, Whatcom County Search and Rescue, for example, they know this county like nobody's business. But then you also have all the way up to the National Guard, you have FEMA, urban search and rescue teams, you've got just a host of different agencies all over. They all have to be brought together. And that was the problem that we saw in Mount St. Helens, was that it took them almost literally days to figure out what does that look like? How do we work together? Is it okay for Whatcom County Search and Rescue to fly on a National Guard helicopter? So in this exercise, what we're going to be doing is we'll be pretending that the lahar went down through the Deming area, and we'll literally be setting up search teams, and we'll be flying them out there on helicopters, and they'll be performing grid searches in the Deming area. So search and rescue is very important. No matter how much notice you give people, no matter how much you hope that they're out of the area, there's always a few Harry Trumans. And in addition to that, those are the people that are just too stubborn to leave if people don't know who Harry Truman was. He's at the bottom of Spirit Lake right now. But that's because he wasn't going to move. Hey, it's not going to erupt. I've been hearing this my whole life, he said. It did go, and he's there. But there's also people that are going to be working there. Talked about the farms. There's a legitimate question. Do the farms continue to operate until the mountain actually does erupt? It's not easy to move 2,000 head of cattle. They have to be milked morning and night. So there's a whole series of things that go on. And what if it's in the August time frame or July time frame when berry season is coming to harvest? You know, you need to think about these things because we're talking about huge amounts of economic money. So those are the decisions that get back to the elected officials. They're going to have to help out with some of those decisions. But back to search and rescue, we're actually going to fully exercise the search and rescue function. Now, I want to talk about recovery for a second, and Rebekah mentioned this. This is, again, from Mount Pinatubo. I was actually at this church in 1999. The eruption was, Seth, 1990? 91. And this particular town was inundated by the lahar in 1995. And so it was 4 years after the eruption that this lahar came down off the mountain and buried this town. Now, this picture was taken about 4 or 5 years ago. And as you can see, the church is functioning. People are out in the garden out front. Families are walking around. They've pretty well recovered. They really have. I was really interesting driving in there in 99 because this is when the lahars were still going on. Lahars are the gift that keep on giving again. That's something Cynthia keeps driving into us. But in 99, we were driving down the road, and all of a sudden I noticed the telephone poles looked a little shorter. And then as you got closer to this town, all of a sudden the houses looked shorter. I thought, gosh, there must be short people that live here. You know, it's funny what you think about when you're looking at it. But it's so big an area, and there were so many homes. You saw some of the pictures I think Jackie had on her slide deck of just the roof sticking out. That's what we ended up. And then we got down into the town, and the church was there. And as you can see, it's pretty well recovered. I want to show you the church beforehand, and then I want somebody to tell me the difference. That's what the church looked like before, okay? There aren't many pictures of it before. Nobody ever went there. All right? And this is after the lahar. Can somebody tell me the difference? Yeah, those second floor windows in the before picture are now the doors of the church. So Rebekah mentioned that, isn't that just amazing? Rebekah mentioned that life might be a little bit different afterwards. When I was there in 99 and we went down there, this was where the lahar was. And they were literally digging the church out from the inside. They literally, the parishioners and the people in the village were literally digging out the ash on the inside and hauling it out. Well, again, lahars are the gift that keep on coming, and it kept on coming, so it kept filling it back up. So now, when you go into the church, the dome, which was way up in the air, is now just like not that far above because they just put in a whole new floor and they've continued on. The point being that recovery can change the way that it's not going to recover to the way it was. It's going to be something that's different into the future. And I think that's important. We have to learn to adapt. We have to learn to live with our mountain. We have to learn to live with the consequences. And to do that really means that we build a resilient community that recognizes the risks that deals with them. And that's why we're so happy to be partnering with all these people up here in formulating this exercise for 2018. It really, we believe, is the way that we can make our community resilient. And in that regard, I really truly want to thank again everybody who's come here today to find out about it. And really, it's something we live with. I think that's the point. It's just there, it's the mountain, not something to be afraid of. For all of you that live in Bellingham, though, I will say this. In the pictures that we have, the risk maps that we have, Jackie showed them, Pete, I think, showed them, I think Seth had it up there. If you notice, Bellingham didn't have anything on it. So there was no yellow area or orange area on Bellingham. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be any effect whatsoever, but it does probably mean that we'd be more in Bellingham like you've seen in the eruption of Mount St. Helens, maybe for Vancouver or Portland, where they had effects, but it's not going to be the lahar on top of it. So no, you don't need to worry about lahars necessarily coming down through Bellingham. You don't need to worry about lava flows coming into Bellingham, but rather we're going to be in a great position here in Bellingham to support the rest of our community. And in talking with our colleague from Bellingham Police, Bob Vanderyacht, who's the city's emergency manager, you know, he and I both recognize that if Mount Baker erupts, it's going to be a complete community effort to recover. And every one of us in Whatcom County are going to be working with it and building it on from there. So with that, Pat, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yes, my name is Kevin Fairshon. I'm president of the Baker Emergency Resource Team up in Kendall. And we service the area from Whatcom up to Mobilization. And we work in alignment with the Whatcom County firewall in Kendall, Chief Jerry Bruin. That being said, one of the things that come up most often with some of our folks up there on the mountain, specifically the glacier area, is they want to get any kind of evacuation route designated for their area should there be some sort of event.
Actually, there is. One of the programs Francis has been working on is identification of those routes. We have received from the state, from some federal money, the evacuation signs, and we're currently working. It kind of goes back to the picture of the drone up there, that cartoon. We have to get approval from FEMA to put the signs up so that it doesn't impact any what's the word, Francis? EHP review, environmental and historic preservation areas. So one of the things, for example, in Glacier is the building which has been identified to put the sign on has to go through that review before we can put the sign up. But we do have them. Simplistically, it's uphill as quick as possible. And there's probably not going to be specifically just for Glacier you go up this road, but rather the education necessary to point out where you can get uphill in the area. But simplistically, that's the answer.
Thank you.
Yes, I wonder if someone could explain what the relationship is. We have a Cascadia 9 earthquake on the volcano.
So that's a question that we get a lot for volcanoes up and down the Cascades. And there's two ways of answering it. Neither one of them is really direct. The first is people have asked that question about volcanoes around the world. Is there a relationship between large earthquakes and volcanoes erupting that are nearby a couple days later? And it turns out that to first order, there isn't. That if you go out a week afterwards and go out like 700 to 800 kilometers, which is 400 or 500 miles, from magnitude 8 up, that statistically there's not a greater likelihood of there being an eruption in that window than there would be at any other random time. So and the way I kind of think of that is that if the volcano isn't ready to erupt already, if there isn't magma that's close to the surface, then it's not going to make much of a difference in the short term whether or not there's a big earthquake. The other way of answering that is through absence of evidence. We've got a couple of things to look at. First off, the 1700 January 20th, I think it is, 26th, January 26th. Yeah, okay. Magnitude 9. In the geologic record, there's no record of eruptions happening at St. Helens, at Rainier, at Baker, up and down the Cascades. Also, there's no evidence of any landslides happening, which would be, in some ways, the more likely thing to happen. They're not big landslides anyway. And that at Mount Rainier is a really big concern. Mount Rainier, over the last 6,000 years, has produced 8 or 9 of these large lahars that have reached into Puget Sound. That's why they have this lahar warning system. And 8 of those have happened in association with the volcano erupting, but 1 doesn't have any geologic evidence of an eruption. That happened 500 years ago, which is in between the 2 Cascadia earthquakes, the 1700 and the one before that. So there doesn't seem to be in the Cascades any really good evidence of magnitude 9 that we know about having had an impact on volcanoes. Did you want to say anything more about that?
Just to clarify, I don't want to add any misconception. This is where that analogy of the shaking the soda falls apart. So if an earthquake were to shake a volcano, it doesn't jostle it up and overpower that. And so I want to make that clear that every analogy has its limits, and this is certainly where that analogy falls apart.
And that would be because there's no soda to shake up inside the volcano. And that's the sort of, so if we had a volcano that was kind of perched, restless, that might not be an unreasonable thing to think could happen. But I'll also sort of, I guess, focus by just letting you know what we talked about at CBO when the next eruption happens. Our biggest concern is going to be our families and our personal safety and our community safety. Once we've got those things taken care of, we'll come back and work on the volcanoes. And that's partly because of this sense from the scientific record that it's not a likely scenario.
So we talked about the lahar coming down the north fork of the Nooksack. So what would that actually do to the flooding, having lived through a 500-year flood, to kind of, if you're going to displace that much water, how's that thing going to change how the rest of the county floods?
Well, what we know, don't touch the table is the lesson there. What we know is that when these lahar paths go down, yes, the rivers reroute hugely and very significantly. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but we can expect, just like in the very, very tiny landslide in comparison Oso, when that slid down, there was a lot of flooding behind that slide, and then some rechannelization across and around it. This will be happening at a much, much larger scale.
One of the things that Cynthia Gardner from USGS has told us in the run-up for this is that it's likely, just think of all the debris that's coming down off the mountain and filling up that river basin. So where it may be, let's just figuratively say 35 feet deep in certain areas along the river, it's now like 12 feet deep. So a 100-year flood event may have more of an effect of a 500-year flood event for some period of time. The other thing about the river that we haven't talked about, but would be very, very important culturally for both the Nooksack as well as the Lummi Nation is the impact on the fisheries. And the fish are returning up the Toutle River area, but Seth, what did it take, like 5-10 years before they started seeing them, or are they even seeing them now?
The fish run up to Spirit Lake, which was a big thing, that is not a thing. It hasn't at all. Right.
Yeah. So that's going to have a huge cultural impact, but that's another change to the river as well. That's the turbidity and debris and everything in the river.
I live in Mount Vernon. Are you planning to have any kind of a forum that's more specific to Mount Vernon?
Actually, this year's event is a Whatcom County exercise. However, Skagit County Emergency Management is participating in the exercise, and I haven't heard of any plans at this point for an event, community event down in Mount Vernon.
So it appears from the worst case scenario map, though, that Skagit Valley is getting more significant impacts as far as the spread of acreage coverage and stuff. And then clearly deleting the I-5 transportation corridor south. So if the Nooksack River is also included, cutting off transportation north to a lesser degree possibly, what are the bigger plans for redeveloping the transportation corridor to get Bellingham, which is sort of what island out of this area, the resources to meet Bellingham?
So I think that's a couple of people answered. So I'll start off by saying that the most likely thing right now, because of the geometry of the vent system, is something going on to the east, and that will put it down to into the ultimate Skagit. But there's Baker Lake, Lake Shannon, that are mitigating factors in there. And Rebekah touched on that a little bit about, that can cut both ways. It can catch material, and if there's warning, and there almost for sure will be some warning, there could be draining of the lakes, and so they could act as a catch. Then there's the possibility of overtopping, and that's when you get the situation going downstream. But the hazard map that we showed is not to imply that all drainages will be impacted during one eruption. The most likely thing is that one drainage will be, and the most likely one right now would be on the Skagit side of things.
I will add that we're also working, well actually we're not, but Puget Sound Energy is under the control of the Corps of Engineers on the lake level. And in 1975, when the mountain was acting up, the lake level was actually drained commensurate with the expected or anticipated amount of debris that would come off on that side. So if the lakes were completely drained, you basically probably not have any impact downstream unless it actually took out the dam itself, and then do more rain flood event. But highway reconstruction. The first thing that would happen after the first Lahar, and remember, we're not looking at it as a single event, we'd have to look at it as a multi-year event in reality, would be assessment of the highway system and the road system, and that would be accomplished with the Department of Transportation, Washington State Department of Transportation, Whatcom County and Skagit County Public Works. Once they assess that and they can begin to see where areas might be stable, then they'd be reestablished in the transportation network.
And what typically happens is there would be temporary roads and workaround roads that could not handle the level of volume or weight traditionally that we carry on the I-5. And so it's not that transportation would be cut off for decades. It would be that it would be slow and crippled for quite some time. But we are also on waterways, and that is going to be one of our saving graces, is that we can ship our way around places that are damaged on the land side.
I have a simple question, more or less, a general question. I live up in North Blaine, and I live in the harbor up there on a small boat, and I've often wondered how the tsunami effect, if there would be any tsunami effect, and how the Lahar situation from Baker, if it does go, affect that community.
So if you didn't hear that, the question was about the effect of Lahar tsunami. And, you know, the tsunami hazard that we see in this area is predominantly from seismic activity, and that would be like the magnitude 9 Great Cascadia earthquake. There's a potential tsunami hazard from smaller crustal earthquakes that would affect the watery regions. We don't expect significant tsunami hazard from Lahar. Certainly anything that can move water, that can push water, can produce tsunami waves. But in the case of Lahar, what you have is a continuous, you know, run into the water and not the kind of rapid input that is required for tsunamis. So the impacts to the bay and all that would be more of a question of sedimentation than it would be of moving water rapidly.
Thank you so much.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to remind everyone of the information tables that are in the back. So before you leave, take a browse. It's all because we're trying to help our community. My question is, thinking back on the image of the 8 triangles of red for the volcanoes that are of most concern, they all seem to be kind of equidistant from the Cascadia subduction zone, and yet they all have different characteristics in their eruptions, and I just want to know why that is.
So every volcano it's a great question. Ultimately, it's got the same kind of architecture underneath, the big structure architecture, just like all humans have the same kind of structure, which is like doctors in medicine works. Every person is different, and every volcano acts differently, and so they're not going to have the same eruptive behavior. They're not going to, for every person in here is going to react differently to some stimulus, maybe getting sick. They're going to react differently than their next door neighbor. And so every volcano is going to have its own characteristics as well. So they do erupt very differently, and that's why it's really important for geologists to be able to go out and map those volcanoes to see, wow, how has this volcano reacted in the past? What eruptive behavior has it had in the past? And that gives us an idea of what might happen in the future. But every individual volcano is going to have its own personality, if you will.
And so one way of thinking about that is that Mount Baker is built on the Chuckanut. It's on a sedentary unit. Mount Rainier is built on top of the Ohanamakash Formation, which is this old metamorphosed marine granodiorite type of thing. So it's a very different kind of rock that magma's coming up through, and magma interacts with whatever it's coming through as it makes its way to the surface. So just that interaction can change things. And then your question also, it's a fundamental question that really is at the basis of a lot of scientific inquiry along the Cascades. And just to give you one sense of the complexity in that, you're right that all the red triangles are kind of equidistant from Cascades, but there's a detail that's different, which is that Mount St. Helens is parallel to Mount Adams and is actually about 20 miles, 30 miles west of where it should be. In terms of the Cascade axis, and how does magma get to Mount St. Helens when it's so far west of where most of the other volcanoes are relative to the slab, relative to the place where magma is being created, is a ginormous question, and how that has
how that impacts the explosivity of that volcano, because it's the most explosive volcano that we have in the Cascades, is a question that scientists are working on.
We could probably geek out on this question for a really long time. So, but it is a really, the point that Seth mentioned about St. Helens and Adams is actually sort of part and parcel of a really broader change that we see along the Cascades in general, that both in terms of the seismic activity and the volcanic activity, there are real differences in sort of the Oregon region and then sort of the southern Washington region, and then really up into BC. So a lot of the research that goes on into these things, you know, it's very easy for us to recognize the need to study the hazard, but fundamentally there's a lot of research that goes into simply understanding the tectonic processes and the connections between these things so that we can better answer those questions. But there really is research in a lot of things that feed into that question in a broader sense, so it's a really excellent point.
Hi, this is more out of curiosity than anything. We didn't talk about ice much, and I was just wondering, do you know what might happen to the glaciers and
In an eruption?
yeah, however eruption there is.
Yeah, so the most likely way that lahars are generated is during an eruption with hot rock coming into contact with the snow and ice. And I mentioned with Mount Rainier that there have been 9 lahars that have reached into the Puget Sound lowlands. And 8 of those were in association with eruptions. They weren't very big eruptions. They were some pyroclastic flow material, some lava flows. But there's so much ice above top of Mount Rainier that it melted enough. And then you've got 14,000 feet down to sea level. There's a lot of vertical elevation to give it momentum. And that's the way that the majority of large lahars are generated, not just in the Cascades, but around the world. So that's the big thing that we worry about with ice-clad volcanoes, like we had in the Pacific Northwest, and snow-clad, is the capacity to generate lahars. You get them for sure in tropical environments. Indonesia gets them a lot, and that's where the term lahar comes from. And there's no ice and snow down there. There it's much more an issue. You've got this loose debris that Pete was describing, and then you have these monsoon rains that give you the water. So the thing that we have with the ice-clad volcanoes is that we have this stored water up there, and once it's melted, and it can be melted pretty quickly if you've got hot rock going down it, then that's an excellent way to generate lahars.
I'm going to throw one quick, this is not really what you asked, but I just wanted to point out one of the other issues with having ice on volcanoes. Ice flows and it cracks and it makes seismic activity. And this is just important in case, I know we have a lot of people who are very curious about these volcanoes, and you may go to the Cascades Volcano Observatory's website and see the live data that come in from the seismometers. And often it looks like these things are exceptionally seismically active, and a lot of the noises that we are recording on these volcanoes are in fact simply ice. So one of the major jobs that people like Seth have to do is to identify which of these signals are volcanic in nature and which are ice. So actually the glaciers really provide us with a lot of challenge for that reason.
Yeah, good morning, Scott Hendrickson, Leonard Streets. It appears that most of the instrumentation and the monitoring is on the surface. Do we have technologies and instruments that are miles and miles below the surface of the Earth monitoring? Where do we stand on that technology?
So yes and no. From a monitoring perspective, really no. And in fact, in terms of placing instrumentation underground, we really don't drill deep anywhere in the world. You know, we have an idea that we can sort of put things underground, but really the deepest that instrumentation is put is typically on the order of a couple hundred meters, if that, and there are only a few places in the world where seismic instruments are buried to that depth. What we do, again, goes back to kind of the longer-term question of research. We can do things looking at, for example, the speeds of seismic waves as they move through subsurface material, and that can provide insight into what type of rock we have, the presence of the possibility, the presence of magma. So we can use sort of external research to get a sense for what's under there. But in terms of actively monitoring things, really not so much. Yeah.
So just to follow on what Jackie was talking about, so service-based instruments are what we work with, and it's very analogous to doctors working with signs and symptoms. And you have a stethoscope, you measure the heart rate, you've got a blood pressure cuff, you measure the blood pressure rate, you've got some diagnostics to go in. It doesn't tell you exactly where you need to be, what you'll be doing, and so then you start doing things like CAT scans, which is what Jackie was talking about in terms of the scientific side of things. The CAT scans give you some more diagnosis, but the best thing would be to go in there and see. And that's pretty invasive, it's hard on our bodies, so that doesn't happen to us very often. And in the earth, it's really hard, it's really difficult to do, it's very expensive to do. What the biggest thing that drives our uncertainty in terms of understanding what's going to happen in the volcanoes, we don't know what's down there. We don't know how much is down there, we don't know how much gas it has, which is what he said, that's what drives explosivity in particular. And I had a geology grad student friend of mine a bunch of years ago say that if she could have one thing, it would be a submersible that she could use to go down and look at what's down there. And then you'd have a much better sense of what's going on. We can't do that. Maybe a couple centuries from now, somebody will figure out how to do that. But until then, we're basically working with measuring signs and symptoms. And so that's where a lot of the uncertainty comes from in our understanding of what's going to happen.
If Mount Baker and all that happens, the cell towers would all be buried, right? So you were talking about communications. How are you going to communicate if your cell phone, there's no tower? So.
Well, the good news is, totally not to do that. The good news is most of the cell towers, particularly in the mountain communities, are up on top of the hills, and they probably will not be affected by the lahars at all. For the ones that are down in the lowland areas, there are a couple that are in there, but the telephone companies have been really looking, it costs them about $1 million to put in each one of those towers, or more. And they don't want to place them in risk areas, so they've been really studying a lot of the risk maps. And I think it's pretty unlikely that we would lose any significant amount of cellular service. There may be some interruptions for some other reasons. Ash, for example, the impact of ash, if there was ash on the western side, which is a question Seth can answer better than I, that could potentially cause some short-term interference, but probably not a big problem.
But I would add that if you live out in the county, you know that the cell service is terrible anyway, and that most people have landlines because of that, or a few people have satellite phones. Landlines might be quite disrupted by the pulling down of lines. And the other thing that disrupts communication is everybody trying to call each other at once. And I guarantee if Mount Baker blows, everybody in all of Western Washington is going to see it and be on their phone, and all of our cell lines are going to go down, and it's not going to have anything to do with impacts to the towers. It's just going to be lines are down. Yeah.
And of course, we could put in a plug for the ham radio folks.
Yay, ham. We need the ham radios because that will be the way to communicate in local and short distances.
And that's another reason that commonly, and again, I know we have a community here of people who focus on preparedness, but it's one of the reasons that we always encourage people to have a contact who is out of state, who may be your relay person who can tell your family elsewhere and can be the communicator, because local lines will be
And then just to add to that, if you do want to respond to those people who are out of state and they're wondering, send a text, because that gets stacked and will go out as soon as it's available, as opposed to making a phone call. So don't call, just text them, let them know you're okay, and you'll contact them later.
And don't post to Facebook.
Ever. Hi, Bob Earl from Down on Chuck, and a question to follow up on the red triangles, the 8 of them. Ask perhaps each of you to just make a subjective judgment, since it's not predictable, but which one of those 8 or which top 2 of those 8 concerned each of you most? I recognize that you could look at them under seismometers, but that's not necessarily reflective of the concerns and constraints of the difficulty of cleaning in and so forth. So any comments to, in some way, rank order the 8?
There's one out there that has the potential to impact huge population centers, Tacoma and Seattle, and Tukwila, and that's Mount Rainier. The exposure level there in terms of the number of people and the ability to evacuate that area is much more difficult because there's people everywhere. And it would come down and affect the ports, which is the driver of Washington State's economy. So hands down, we have a no big deal problem here.
I think that speaks, I think that speaks to the hazard versus risk issue, that there are hazards, potential hazards at all these volcanoes, and they vary, as Pete pointed out. The volcanoes have different habits, different behaviors, but ultimately, in terms of a concern perspective, the issue is risk and exposure and population density and facilities and infrastructure. I'd be shocked if we didn't all say we're here, but we'll see.
I'm going to echo all of those statements. Yeah, Rainier would be the top of my list.
Oh, well, obviously Mount Rainier has a much higher potential. However, in talking with Cynthia and a couple others, I think while there's no solid evidence, I think it's safe to say the potential impact on infrastructure when you weigh that in there, and economic impact, it may very well be Mount Baker would be the second. Certainly my first, but Mount Baker. And we've talked about the Northwest Pipeline, for example. Just to expand on that just for a second. That is 40% of the natural gas supply to the western United States. So that would be one area that would be shut down for some period of time. And for Whatcom County, there is no reroute available for getting natural gas back in here. The Demi meter station, which is what feeds all of Whatcom County with natural gas, including the cities of Bellingham, Ferndale, Lincoln, that is smack dab in the middle of the hard area in Demi. So that would have to be shut down at very least until it could be assessed and put back up again. And then again, yeah, and it may not, as Rebekah said, be put back up again. So, but in terms of dollar laws, there's no question that Mount Rainier is the one that would have the greatest impact. But I think I would argue that Mount Baker is probably right up there when we look at what the impact would be. And loss of agriculture, again, as Rebekah pointed out, the impact on the international trade routes from Canada down through here, it's pretty significant.
I'm going to give the least satisfying answer. Because, well, a pithy answer is all of them are important, and it's the next one that's erupting that's going to be the one that's going to be a real problem. And it would, with St. Helens in 2004, which I said before is a really small eruption, in order to handle the media interest and all that, folks from up here had to come down to help out with the Joint Information Center. So that was a region-wide event, and it was a very, very small event. But in terms of the ones that have the biggest, I guess, concern for the observatory in terms of where we put our resources and time, there's an interesting question. You know, so Mount St. Helens is the most likely volcano to erupt again. So from the hazard perspective, that's a very important thing to pay attention to. It's erupted on average about once a century for going back 3,000, 4,000 years. So that's one where we have to stay ready for the next eruption. We can't just say, oh, it's been 30 years, we're going to let those stations die. We have to pretend, and when it wakes up fast. It wakes up by a week's notice. So we have to be ready for that. Mount Rainier clearly has got the exposure factor. It wins on that for up and down the Cascades. But another place that we worry about a lot is Mount Hood. And Mount Hood is a place that has people in that near field zone. There's government camp, there's two highways, Highway 26, Highway 35, that goes right by. There's 4 ski areas that run around there. And Mount Hood erupts in a very small way, not like Mount St. Helens did in 1980, but it would take a small eruption. All it would take would be a small one to put all of that into harm's way. And there would be some really nasty societal questions about closing highways, closing access to ski areas, evacuating people, and potentially it could be like that for decades. And that's the one I look at and think, wow, that's the one that we could look really bad as a scientific group because of all this uncertainty and society's need for us to be able to get it right on a very, very fine line about predicting these small explosions, which are basically not predictable, because that's what people need to know. So each volcano's got a sort of different universe in terms of things to think about, in terms of those red triangles. And for some, for Mount St. Helens, the hazard side of things is a bigger question than the exposure. Mount Rainier, the exposure factor is a big, big issue, much less so than the sort of eruption frequency. And Mount Baker's got sort of its own mix. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing all your expertise and time to this. I really appreciated what I'll call the consequence analysis part of the economic, agricultural, cultural impact, and we see all the question marks down the right column of that slide. And when I hear John talking about a huge drill in October, I'm wondering if all of the red triangles have been risk-weighted, evaluated the same way, the same pattern, to see where the feds and the state should put money to do the next exercise. And then when they do that, is there enough money in those budgets to carry on lessons learned to inform the next set of exercises? Because if they're all done independently, we'll learn a lot slower and a lot less. So thanks again for coming.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for that question. There are tabletop exercises that have been happening for maybe about a decade with each of the coordination plans. So there's a coordination plan in place for all of the red triangles to varying degrees. There's one in Oregon, Central Oregon plan, which actually hasn't been officially signed off yet at the state level, but that's been in process. And one of the fundamental steps in each of those coordination plans is doing a tabletop to drill it, to see how well you've got things nailed down, or if you need to make tweaks here and there. Whatcom County for the last couple of years has been the epicenter for ground zero. No, it's not a good either. For really taking the lead on that kind of effort, and it's been great to see. And there's been a tremendous number of resources devoted to it, more than I've been seen in any other kind of tabletop. But tabletops can be small, they can be large, and there's different ones that are aimed at testing different types of responses.
I think that's fairly accurate, Seth. One thing we are doing, though, Dave, is we are documenting everything we're doing so that it can be provided to other jurisdictions. Seth mentioned the last couple of years. Last year, we did this same scenario with Homeland Security for a similar type of event, and we focused solely on communications. This particular time, we're expanding it out. And principally, while there's a coordination plan, that coordination plan is primarily a state and federal plan. And it doesn't really say, okay, Whatcom County, when we say this, you evacuate that. That's not the type of plan it is. but it is that high level point. So we wanted to take it a little bit, that next step down, and say, all right, let's actually exercise as if it was in fact a real event and what that would mean to Whatcom County. Again, the lessons learned we'll be able to provide to others. And on the coordination plan, one of the outcomes on this exercise, and the state is driving this effort, along with Cynthia, is an update of the Mount Baker Glacier Peak Coordination Plan. So literally all of this is being done kind of simultaneously.
Anybody else have any questions? What?
So there was a question about asphalt, and the one thing that the simplified hazard map doesn't show, doesn't do a good job of, is that, the question of what's the likelihood of asphalt. And it's a difficult question to answer because a lot of it has to do with the wind, and what's the direction of the wind on a particular day. Another question is how big is that eruption going to be that puts ash into the air. So it's hard to do a hazard map for that, but we're working on it. And one of the things that we're working on now is a product that asks the question, what's my chance of getting ash, period. And it could be from Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier. With Mount St. Helens, there was one eruption in 1980 where the winds were blowing due west, and Cannon Beach got a bunch of ash, which was weird. It was really weird. So it can happen. So the ballpark number for if a volcano erupts, if Mount Baker erupts, around here is likelihood is between 1% and 5%, not on a specific day, but just in general. The winds are blowing the right direction between 1% and 5% of the time for this area to get a trace amount, which would be a big problem, but not like one that's going to cause roofs to collapse and things like that. It'd be more of a nuisance with having electronics interfere with trying to figure out what do you do with it on your car. Last summer there were fires that put ash into Portland, put ash into Seattle. Did any of that come up here as well? Yeah, so same kinds of questions, right? You see that stuff in your car, what do you do? Do you wipe your windshield wipers on it? No, you don't do that because there's some abrasive stuff in that ash that will scratch the glass. So you wash it off with water. In Oregon, in Portland, in 1980, there was an event that put ash, more than a trace, into Portland. And people started washing off their driveways, and that ash went into the sewer system and the drainage system, and that caused a big problem. So there's these sort of cascading downstream effects that all be mindful. And on the back over there, there's a fact sheet about asphalt and what kinds of things can you do with it. It doesn't help you with the question of likelihood, but I can answer provisionally your question that were Mount Baker to erupt, there'd be something like a 1% to 5% chance that there'd be a dusting.
And with that dusting, one of the big factors is air filters. Anything that uses air to operate, your lungs is one, but any kind of internal combustion engine, generators, any of those things, those air filters get clogged really quickly with the ash. So an important thing to do is to either have spare or air filters, have a way to rinse those out, or to install an air filter. And if that's your lungs, a wet cloth bandana over your mouth is a great idea, or air mask is a great idea if that ash is kind of around in here.
And I was just going to point out that it is going to be generally a nuisance, except when it's not, and for people who have compromised health, especially lungs and asthma and that sort of thing, this is not going to be a nuisance. This is going to be quite problematic for air traffic control and visibility, and quite problematic even for places that need to be kept clean, like server farms.
The 85th percentile, by the way, on the winds is to the east. in Whatcom County. So, not that that's a guarantee or anything, but what that would mean if there was a sustained eruption and produced a lot of ash is the national park would be pretty significantly impacted. We haven't really talked about that, but the national park, North Cascades National Park, and Seattle City Light are both more likely to receive ash than we are down here. And Seattle City Light has started looking at whether or not that issue of the ash that would accumulate within the turbines would in fact be a problem. But most likely the ash fall would cause, at very least, as well as the hard Mount Baker, or the Baker Lake area, shut down that power supply system, and it would in fact also an eruption, at least temporarily shut down Seattle City Light and the dams up there.
So I just realized, when I brought up ash in my PowerPoint, I was remiss in not pointing out that one of the really significant hazards that the volcano observatories focus on is the effect of ash on aircraft. And in fact, this has been a major issue that there are several really remarkable stories of aircraft that were affected by ash. It turns out that the melting temperature of ash is about the operating temperature of a jet engine. And so consequently, you can have ash intake into an engine that can shut down access to fuel. And there have been a couple of very, very near misses. So a lot of the monitoring that Seth's group and then the Alaska Volcano Observatory are involved with are largely focused on that particular issue. Certainly when, I'm not going to say it right in November, but he can say it, in Iceland. You may remember several years back, major eruption in Iceland that shut down air traffic in Europe for quite a long time. So there are impacts that also will affect things more broadly from the production of ash that have to do with transportation.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Okay, great. I want to thank you for attending, and if you have an opportunity to stop by the tables in the back, please do so. Carrie, I would like you to stand up, please. Carrie Temple, who is our unit lead for the Volunteer Mobilization Center, who works very, very hard to you do a curtsy. All righty. And I'd like to thank all of our volunteers and all of our benefactors. And if any of you are interested in, participating in Volunteer Mobilization Center, we do have monthly meetings at the Center for Spiritual Living on the second Monday of the month from 6 to 8 p.m. And there is some information about that in our brochures that are at the back. But again, please, if you haven't already volunteered, we're a really great organization and would love to have you. And thank you so much. Thank you.